Immanuel Kant was far and away one of the most important and profound thinkers in the modern epoch. In many ways, he sets a sort of temporal boundary to the Enlightenment. He is, in many ways, I would argue, the last of the great Enlightenment thinkers, and is in many ways a transitional figure. What follows Kant will be the rise of Romanticism in the literary world, and its philosophic equivalent, German idealism, in the philosophic world. I would urge, as Descartes is a fundamental, or represents a fundamental conjuncture in the history of philosophy, and in fact is usually used as the demarcation of the beginning of modern philosophy, so Kant also represents a similar demarcation within modern philosophy. And in fact, it is fairly standard in histories of philosophy to talk about the pre-Kantian and post-Kantian period. Kant was in many ways one of the most systematic and complete philosophers, had an aesthetic theory, a moral theory. What I'm going to discuss with you is his epistemological theory and his critique of metaphysics from a very famous work known as the Critique of Pure Reason. I will try to give you very much a sort of skeleton outline of the argument of Critique of Pure Reason. It's an immense book, close to 800 pages, extremely technical, but I think the overall point is not that difficult to get and is very much fundamental to all the philosophic speculation that follows Kant. Everyone is very much dealing in what I would call the Kantian problematic. Kant is in many ways the first of the modern foundational thinkers, in the sense that he wants to build, before he arrives at any sort of philosophic speculation, he wants to begin with an absolutely certain foundation upon which all of the rest of his philosophy can be recursively built. And that foundation should be purely logical, and it should tell us, in fact, what can and can't be known on a purely formal level. Kant was profoundly affected by the writings of David Hume, as I mentioned previously. He had a fairly long philosophic career before he read Hume, never published anything of much significance, and then read Hume and claimed that Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumbers. He had been very much raised and taught in both Lutheran pietism, but more significantly in that continental rationalist tradition, which in Germany is best represented by Leibniz. And it was only through reading very small snippets of Hume that he began to see that the whole rationalist project was essentially dogmatic and uncertain, and in fact intensely problematic. What he attempted to do with Hume was to respond to Hume's claims, specifically his skeptical conclusions, in such a way as to undermine those conclusions without rejecting his fundamental insights. So he wants to get beyond that sort of empirical skepticism without at the same time falling into the trap of dogmatic rationalism. In fact, I would urge that Kant, at least in the Critique of Pure Reason, represents an attempt, and I think a fairly successful attempt at that, to synthesize the rationalist and empiricist traditions. If you try to summarize those in a nutshell, what you get is that the rationalist tells you your knowledge comes from your reason, from your pure faculty of reason in your mind. Right? All of our knowledge and certainty comes from that faculty. The empiricist says no, that faculty isn't even a faculty so much, it's just sort of the manipulation of symbols according to very precise grammatical rules. Our real knowledge of the world comes from our senses, from experience. So Kant, in many ways, quite sensibly argues the real truth of epistemology will certainly include both elements, which is to say we can have no knowledge without experience. The empiricists are absolutely right there. But in a way, Hume has shown us that experience will not give us enough, right? Because we wound up with such conclusions that, for instance, causality is just custom, it's habitual, and there's no rational basis for it. So here we see an attempt to synthesize these two great traditions of the 2 centuries preceding Kant. And Kant rephrases this problem in terms of what he considers the critical question, specifically for philosophy, and that is whether metaphysics can be a science. It's quite clear that it hasn't been a science up to this date. That if one compares Newtonian physics, on the one hand, to, say, Cartesian dualism or Plato's theory of the forms, there's not very strong family resemblance between those two sets of doctrines. One would certainly have no reservations calling the Newtonian theory science, and yet would have great reservations saying the same for either Descartes' dualism or Plato's doctrine of forms. And he wants to ask if, first of all, if it is possible to have a science of metaphysics, whether it can be proven to be possible or proven to be impossible once and for all. And specifically because he's concerned about three metaphysical issues which he thinks are the most important issues in our lives. And those are, whichever way they're decided, God, freedom, and immortality. And we all have a practical interest in the resolution of those questions or answers to those questions in one way or another. So, for Kant, then, he rephrases that question in terms of the following sort of technical formulation, which is, his critical epistemological question is how synthetic a priori propositions are possible and true. Now, that's a very difficult sort of phrase, and I'm going to try and take you through it piece by piece. First of all, you've heard me mention previously a priori knowledge, and that is presumably knowledge which, while it may be prompted by experience, is underived from experience. Okay? For Kant, we might come up with the following example. The statement that, for example, all physical events are spatio-temporal. Okay? Now, that is a true proposition. It is not derived from experience, because any thought or any possible event you can imagine, even in imagination, will be spatio-temporal. And we oppose that, in terms of contrast, to say an a posteriori proposition that is purely derived from experience. For example, all U.S. presidents are male. Right? There's no logical reason why that should be the case. It is possible that a woman might have been elected president previously, but it just hasn't been so. And that you can only know from experience. So that's the a priori versus a posteriori. A priori is that which, though arises from experience, is not derived from it. Now, the other part of that rather difficult phrase, synthetic. Synthetic propositions are those in which the predicate is not contained in the concept of the subject. And in fact, that's contrasted to analytic propositions where the predicate is contained in the concept of the subject. Don't worry about predicate and subject. Let's look at examples. An analytic statement would be, for example, all bodies are extended. The reason being that the concept of body includes within it the concept of extended, right? What is a body but an extended mass? Therefore, the statement that all bodies are extended is analytically true. It's true simply by understanding the meaning of the word body. If you know what body means, you know that all bodies are extended. And a very common example most people believe is analytic would be all bachelors are unmarried men. Right? If you know what the word bachelor means, you don't have to go around in experience and check out all bachelors to see if they're unmarried. If you understand the word bachelor, you know that it means unmarried man. That's an analytic proposition. So a synthetic proposition will be one where the predicate is not contained in the concept of the subject. And for contrast, we could say, all bodies are heavy. It is conceivable that we could come across a body which had no mass whatsoever. Right? We come across a large podium which can float away on its own. The notion of heaviness is not contained in the concept of body. So then that would be a synthetic judgment. Okay. Now let's put it back together and get a synthetic a priori judgment or proposition. Such a judgment would tell us information about the world, right? Because it's synthetic, it tells us something new, but it would not be derived from experience. An example would be the statement that every event has a cause. That tells us necessary truth about the world, that all the things we experience in the world are caused. And yet, as Kant notes, Hume showed us that it could not be derived from experience, right? That causality is nothing but constant conjunction at the experiential level. So then the question becomes, since we know that every event has a cause, and we know that we can't derive it from experience, and we know that it's synthetic a priori, how can such judgments be possible? And I should point out that Kant thought there was a fairly large range of synthetic a priori judgments. Specifically, perhaps the most important class for him was mathematics. He thought that mathematics were all synthetic a priori judgments. They were not pure logic. And one of his famous examples is, if you take the proposition 7 plus 5 equals 12, the analysis of 7, 5, and the operator plus does not give you the answer. The answer is only done, the answer of 12 is only arrived at actually doing the calculation of working out that iterated successor operation of addition. And that's the only way you know that 7 plus 5 equals 12. So that it's not derived from experience, but it is nonetheless synthetic. It's a synthetic a priori proposition. So there's actually quite a few of these synthetic a priori propositions, and it's quite difficult to try to explain how they could be, first of all, possible, and then secondly, true. And then the way of explaining that is Kant's so-called Copernican revolution. Now you'll remember, Copernicus's breakthrough occurred by asking if, instead of taking the Earth as a motionless mass around which the heavenly bodies revolve, suppose that the Earth was in fact in motion and the sun was at rest. What would be the results of such a posit? How could we then colligate our observations? Would they be colligated more simply or less simply? And it turns out much more simply. We don't have to add epicycles to the motion of the various heavenly bodies. They're straight ellipses, which is a good reason then to say that that Copernican switch, that sort of gestalt switch from one way of looking at it to another, is justified. Well, Kant offers an analogous breakthrough in epistemology. What he suggests is, rather than having the mind correspond to objects in order to have truth, perhaps, or suppose, objects have to correspond to our knowledge. Right? In other words, instead of our minds, as it were, revolving around the physical world, perhaps it's the other way around. Our objective world actually revolves and has to conform to our minds. If that's the case, that would make synthetic a priori knowledge of objects possible. What we would argue then would be that objects cannot be objects of knowledge unless they're subject to certain a priori conditions of the human mind. And we could put it in terms of the form and matter scheme of the ancients. The matter of our objective knowledge comes from sense experience, but the form is supplied by certain a priori concepts of the human mind. Thus, the objects of our knowledge are all of our representations, as it were, are phenomena, which is to say, objects represented according to those, let us argue, a priori conditions of mind. And they are not what Kant calls noumena, or things in themselves. We never experience the world as it is in and of itself. We only experience the world as it is under our own representations of it. And that's, of course, his first important metaphysical distinction between things in themselves, or noumena, of which we are never aware, and phenomena of which we are consistently aware. Now, the form of phenomena, right, the form of our mental representations, is that which allows sense appearances, or what Kant calls sensibility, to be arranged in certain relations, in certain definite relations. And these forms are supplied a priori by the human mind. Now, Kant argues that there are two pure forms of sensibility, two sort of rubrics we impose on all of the sense datum we receive. The study of these two forms of sensibility, Kant calls transcendental aesthetic, and aptly called aesthetic because it refers to visual representations, the form of sensibility. Transcendental because these forms transcend the sense datum themselves, go beyond it. And these two forms are space and time. I want to pause here for a minute to think about this. In a way, he is, again, answering Hume, right? Hume could well point out to us, we never actually experience space, do we? It has no color, no flavor, no texture. Similarly with time. So therefore, they must be, quote, a non-existent empirical phenomena or something like that, or non-phenomena. Kant disagrees. Kant says what we really have, space and time, are supplied by the mind. The mind orders all of our sensual representations in a three-dimensional grid. It imposes it. Thus, space is not a part of the noumenal realm, of things in themselves, but rather it's part of the phenomenal realm. We take sense datum, and before we're even aware of it, before we're even conscious of it, the mind has already imposed it into a three-dimensional grid of space. Now, of course, this is very important for Kant because it allows us to explain the possibility of geometry. How can we have synthetic a priori knowledge of space in geometry? And he says it's because, actually, the very form of space is part of, to use a metaphor, the hardware of the human mind. Right? So, since we have that hardware, we simply play out its, how would we put it, its logical implications, and that is simply what geometry is. Similarly with mathematics. Now, the mind also orders all both sensual and internal representations of consciousness, right? Not only your experience of, quote, external phenomena, but also your psychic states of desire and one thought after another in terms of temporal sequence. And consider that. Each of your mental representations, both of external and internal phenomena, even of your own stream of consciousness, as it's called today, comes in temporal order. And Kant's point is that time is not something, as it were, out there. Time is one of the ways your mind, before you're even aware of it, orders all of its representations, orders all of its psychological states. It imposes time and space on them in a series of temporal relations of before and after. Now, at that point, you now have the first part of Kant's critique of pure reason, transcendental aesthetic. If you understand that argument, I think it'll make the other parts much more simple. You'll see that the same strategy is used over and over. And I'm going to use that as an excuse to try to be a bit more cursory with transcendental analytic, the next section, because it's extremely technical and abstruse, and I'll give you, I think, in your leisure, you'll have enough time to consider it and think about it and flesh it out. Basically, again, in skeletal form, the argument runs that human knowledge is a combination of both sensibility, right, which is a combination of sense datum plus those two pure forms of transcendental aesthetic, and understanding. In other words, all animals have sensibility. Humans also have understanding. We represent things in propositions. Now, if the forms of sensibility are called transcendental aesthetic, then the forms of understanding are called transcendental analytic, or better yet, transcendental logic. Now, this logic studies a priori concepts, or, quote, categories, which are necessary conditions for an object to be thought rather than simply perceived. And, of course, that's what you have on that table of categories, next to which is a table of judgments. Now, these categories function to synthesize the manifold of phenomena, right? You've got that bloom buzz and confusion of representations between your ears as you take in sense datum, and that becomes synthesized into propositions, judgments, and claims according to the various categories. Therefore, these categories have objective reference, because objects, to be objects of our knowledge, must conform to them. In fact, objects are very much like Berkeley, sense datum plus plus our own parsing, our own sort of cookie cutting of it. Now, Kant argued that there were really only four fundamental sorts of categories. There was the category of quantity, which includes three elements, a triad of unity, plurality, totality. There was the category of quality, which includes reality, negation, and limitation. There was the category of relation, right, which includes inherence and subsistence. That one I think is a little bit confusing. Let me explain it. What he means by that is substance and accident, or subject and predicate. He says that's one of the ways the mind organizes judgments about relation, is in terms of that sort of dichotomy. And his point is that that's not something you find in the world. That's something that the mind imposes on our manifold of experience to create our object world. The other relation is causality and dependence. And the third of relation is of community. And finally are the modal categories, or categories of modality, possibility and impossibility, existence, non-existence, necessity, contingency. Now, what's interesting is if you look at each of these, this table of categories, you'll find that in each grouping, each triad, as it were, the first and second element take the form of what Hegel will call thesis and antithesis. They're sort of opposites. And the third category is the synthesis of those two. So the thesis of quantity would be, as it were, unity, oneness. And we saw this in pre-Socratic philosophy with the Eleatic philosophers, right? Parmenides and Zeno. Opposed to that is plurality, the quantitative pluralism that one would find in, say, Empedocles or Anaxagoras. You contrast that, the view of the one and the many, and if you synthesize these two opposites, you get the notion of totality, the many making up the one. Right? And similarly, he thinks if you look at quality, reality is opposed by negation. If you put those two together, you arise, through the synthesis of those two, the concept of limitation, etc., etc. Now, he points out that all of the acts of the understanding can be reduced, it can either be described as understanding or can be reduced to judgments. And thus, each judgment is in part the result of a category or a priori concept of the understanding. And hence you'll find on the right of your table of categories is a table of judgments, which is basically the same thing transposed into the form of judgment. Now the problem arises. How do you know which category to impose on any given representation? Kant argues that the faculty of imagination works as a mediator between, on the one hand, sensibility, right, our perception, as it were, and on the other hand, our understanding. And it does so by producing something he calls schemata. And these schemata, which it produces and both produces and bears, let us know which categories are applicable for a given appearance or perception. Okay, so for Kant, a schema is a rule that specifies the production of images and which delimits a category to permit its application to appearances. Extremely abstract and abstruse. I will try to give you an example. Take the category of substance. The schema of the imagination, right, represents this substance as sort of a permanent Urstoff or substratum of change, which is capable of changing in time. So therefore, when we see a representation of something that seems to be in the process of change, our imagination produces the schema of substance, and we realize that we apply, when we see something changing, let's say a leaf turning from green to brown, we say, therefore it is a substance, something which over time changes, and then we know which category to apply. And in fact, it is that ability to know which category to apply which makes the application of the categories possible. Now, if we take these two pure forms of sensibility, right, what we call transcendental aesthetic, space and time, and these various categories of the understanding, and put them together, they comprise what subsequent philosophers would call a conceptual scheme. And the point is, I would urge, since Kant, I think most philosophers have agreed, at least for some time after Kant, that in fact the world does not come sliced and diced the way we experience it. That in fact we get a certain range of sense hits on our receptors and organize it according to just such a conceptual scheme. And it was Kant's fundamental insight first to recognize the importance of that conceptual scheme and to attribute it to, as it were, the firmware, the hardware of the human mind. And again, the key is that this all occurs before consciousness. That the brain or mind does all of these manipulations, all of these syntheses, all of these impositions before we're even aware of it. And so such conceptual schemes are imposed on our sense experience, and if you take our sense experience, add our conceptual scheme, then you get our objective world. That's just what our world of objects is sense datum plus a conceptual scheme. Now, this raises the third part of Kant's critique, something he calls transcendental dialectic. And that deals with the possibility of metaphysics. For we point something very important out. Our conceptual scheme, those categories, only apply to phenomena, right? In fact, they are what forms sense datum into phenomena. And therefore, the problem with metaphysics is it attempts to go beyond phenomena, doesn't it? Metaphysics tries to tell us that which we can't sense. It tries to tell us that which is beyond any possible experience. And while that is obviously epistemologically problematic, Kant nonetheless says, if we really want to be analytically clear about this, we have to explain, first of all, how does that ever happen? Why would this animal make such an absurd mistake to apply the categories beyond what they are categories of, phenomena, to, quote, noumena? And he argues that metaphysics arises from a natural disposition of the human mind to apply our conceptual scheme transcendentally. Right? You've heard this expression in Professor Dalton's discussion of Thoreau. And the notion was that you could apply these categories, and I think everyone has that disposition, to apply these categories beyond the realm of sense, beyond the realm of phenomena, to transcend such a realm, hence transcendentally. And in fact, what you're trying to do is get beyond the realm of phenomena to the realm of noumena, things in themselves. And the purpose is, he says, every human mind that is reflective has a desire to achieve overarching unities, completely consistent accounts. That's what we yearn for, and we're never satisfied till we get it. So we have it all sort of packed into one infinitely elastic bag. We can tie a knot on it. Anything new we find up, we just stick it in that bag and there's more room. Now, a couple points to arise from this. First of all, since our conceptual scheme is objective only for phenomena, metaphysics can give us no certain or even probable knowledge about the way the world really is. So that's the first thing he's resolved right away. Metaphysics as a science is actually impossible. And it can never give you truth about the world. We can never know noumena or things in themselves. And I think that's a sort of painful admission from Kant. But again, that's a result of his, I would urge, intellectual honesty. I don't think he wanted to find that result, but he tried to solve the problems of Hume, and that was about as far as he could go. He had to acknowledge that it does not, in fact, give you any legitimate knowledge of the world. In fact, its pure transcendental application produces antinomies, or paradoxes. And he supplies 4 of them. I'm not going to go into all 4. I'm going to look at one, the one that seems to me to actually be something close to an antinomy. And he says, again, let's apply our notion of time transcendentally. And we come up with the idea that, as a pure transcendental proof of time, that the world must have a beginning and an end, right? Elsewise, you're stuck with the problem of an infinite regress, right? And that is completely intellectually unsatisfactory and logically impossible. Therefore, the world must have a beginning in time. and must have similarly a beginning in space. It must be spatially bounded. Then he says, well, that's completely logically consistent. The problem is, so is the following proposition, which is that the world has no beginning in time and has no spatial boundary. And he says, well, why is that obvious? He says, well, think about it. If you are willing to take a look at the other transcendental perspective, the other side of the antinomy, you realize that the problem of infinite regress is not in fact avoided by positing a first beginning of time, because what happened before that first beginning? And it's not solved by saying there is a limit to space, because what's outside of that limit? So he says, in fact, both of those propositions are completely logically acceptable, they both seem to be true, and they're both metaphysical. And that's the problem of using transcendental dialectic, is that since it doesn't actually apply to phenomena, it can neither be true or false. It can never be verified or disproven. And in fact, leads to nothing so much as antinomy and paradox. But he does find the silver lining in the cloud. Although such transcendental dialectic doesn't give us any legitimate knowledge, it does have a very important regulative function in our inquiry. Specifically phenomenal inquiry. Take, for example, the transcendental idea of the world as a totality. Right? And this is a good point he's making. There is no reason to assume that the world is one. One could very easily say that the world is discontinuous, that laws of nature don't apply on Pluto or Mars, or that there is not fundamentally one universe. I mean, a very difficult thing to say because, as I think Kant would argue, the very term universe, one voice or verse, as it were, reflects that transcendental dialectic working itself out in the human mind. But one needn't have that idea. But what are the consequences of having it? Something which can never be proven, may not even be true, but what are the advantages of having it? Well, if you believe that the world is a totality, that there is, as it were, a universe, that prompts us to seek for unconditional laws. That prompts us to go beyond our limited inductions and come up with, quote, laws of nature, or natural laws. So, he argues, if you did not believe that the world was a unity, a totality, Newton would never have argued that there were universal laws of gravitation. He would have said, if you sit in England, in this part of England, and observe phenomena, you will notice that from this part of England, in these space-time coordinates, these following laws prevail. But Newton's not satisfied with that. He has that transcendental dialectic going on in the back of his head, and it forces him to try and extrapolate those laws as broadly as possible. And that has an immensely valuable regulative function for our understanding and our inquiry. Another example that he points out is that whenever we have a representation, we can add to it the phrase, I think. And that is the way we come up through a sort of transcendental dialectic to posit an actual ego, a self, right, which is bearing all of these representations. And he points something out. That's a transcendental idea. I mean, he's going to be fair to Hume. If you really want to look at what the empirical ego is, all you really know about yourself is one damn thing after another. Right? You get one representation, then another representation, then another representation, and you never actually see yourself. It's just a show. And you are whatever, the screen showing the show. And Kant's point is that no one actually thinks that about themselves, but if they were limited, if empiricism were the case, and all of our knowledge derived from sense, that's the only way we could think of themselves. Hume is quite right. If you play the empiricist game out, logically, you wind up with that. Nothing but the empirical ego, one damn thing after another. Nonetheless, each and every one of us, because we have that propensity towards transcendental dialectic, posits a fundamental unity, the I, which, he says, may not be true, but has important regulative function, doesn't it? Right? It connects our life projects into something we might call biographies. It helps us recognize cultivated tastes, dispositions over time. It helps us attribute moral responsibility for action. So, again, these transcendental notions have a profound regulative function. Finally, however, we get back to Kant's main theme. What are the most important transcendental ideas: God, freedom, and immortality. And he says, what's interesting here is that the ones that really matter for us in our lives, their regulative function has nothing to do with science or inquiry in any of its, quote, pedestrian forms or technical forms. Where do they have an important regulative function? In morality, right? A moral scheme which does not allow for God, freedom, and immortality will be just that sort of perhaps sentimentalism of Hume. So in fact he argues that the ultimate metaphysical issues get cashed in not in science, not in aesthetics, but in morality. They have fundamentally important regulative functions. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to leave that in the very able hands of Professor Sugrue. What I will talk about, however, is briefly what happened to Kantian transcendental philosophy after Kant. Because what Kant argues is, as we'll remember, is that all of our knowledge applies only to phenomena, that our transcendental knowledge of noumena is not in fact knowledge at all, but simply sort of regulative heuristic principles for subsequent inquiry. And that the real world is the real world of noumena, things in themselves which we never actually are aware of. It was not a large leap for subsequent German absolute idealists to ask the question of Kant, since we never perceive noumena, since noumena have no explanatory function in our discussions, and since noumena are never experienced, what makes you think there are noumena? Why do you believe in things in themselves? And once you have asked that question, someone is naturally going to say, well, let's apply Occam's razor again and cut out the noumena. And that's the perspective called absolute idealism. I spoke to you earlier about this with Berkeley. With German idealism, it reaches a much more full sort of flowering. Because rather than saying that the ideas we get come from an external force, rather our object world is simply our internal ideas imposed on whatever datum we have. And things in themselves, and here's the important intuition, is that the belief that there are things in themselves is the belief that although we're not aware of it, the world really is made of natural kinds. It really is parsed one way or another. Just we don't know about it. And we have to go through our own parsing, which is imposed by the mind. Absolute idealism suggests there is no reason to assume that the world is actually parsed at all, that it has any natural beginnings or endings, right? That it's all imposed. All objects are simply, nominally or phenomenally, are simply the imposition of our intellectual or mental categories on the world. That's one important implication of Kant. The next is, it will take perhaps 50 years before subsequent philosophers start studying enough of world history to realize, you know, not everybody's got this conceptual scheme. There are peoples that don't know about cause and effect, don't argue in terms of cause and effect. There are peoples who don't know about substance and accident. And then, how do we explain the fact that different cultures have different conceptual schemes? And the explanation turns out to be language. Right? That language is the way we represent and posit our conceptual schemes. When you learn a vocabulary, you in fact learn a specific interpretation of the world. As Quine playfully puts it, ontology recapitulates philology. The study of what there is recapitulates the study of the linguistic posit structure of your speech community. And so that's why I stress how important Kant was. Kant made possible that linguistic turn in philosophy, which all subsequent philosophers have taken. Not because he saw the importance of language, but because he was the first to introduce the notion of conceptual scheme. And once it became clear that such conceptual schemes might in fact not be a result of mental hardware, the obvious choice was then it must be a result of mental software. And that software would take the form of different languages or linguistic communities or sociolects or idiolects. And so in that sense, Kant is also the forebearer to all of our modern linguistic philosophy. Finally, Kant is important for one other school of thought, a school of thought that we will discuss, which is an American school of thought known as pragmatism. For think in a certain way what Kant is saying about transcendental dialectic and about these pure ideas, a priori notions. They're not true, but we should still believe in them. Why? Because they're useful. They have an important pragmatic function in regulating inquiry and life. No one had thought to make an argument like that before. Right? You believe something either because it's true or you disbelieve it because it's false. Well, and such truth resides in a correspondence with reality. But since we know with Kant that our phenomena probably don't correspond to noumena at all, there is good grounds for saying rather than should we believe this proposition because it's true, it mirrors the world, rather we have good grounds for saying should we believe this because is it useful to believe? Does it help us perhaps prompt further inquiry? Does it help us perhaps appreciate aesthetic life more richly and fully? And finally, and I would urge most importantly, does it help us create a morally satisfying universe? And with that question, I'm going to leave you in the hands of Professor Sugrue.